So I watched Return to Silent Hill. And to be honest, I did not go into this with high expectations due to the fact that I saw the promotional material before it was released. And let's just say that elder millennial emo James and the unstyled Temu wig Maria did not exactly give me a lot of hope. Keep in mind that the budget for this movie was $23 million. Another reason I was skeptical was not only because video game adaptations have a long history of being deeply disappointing and wildly unfaithful to their source material, but because Silent Hill has already fumbled its film adaptations in the past. That said, I actually liked and will defend the first Silent Hill movie to an extent. This is especially worth noting given that Return to Silent Hill is directed by the same filmmaker. So the obvious question then becomes, if I liked the first movie, why did I remain skeptical for Return to Silent Hill? Before getting into that answer, a quick spoiler warning. This video essay will discuss and spoil content from both Silent Hill, the game, and films. Part of the reason the original movie earned my approval is purely for aesthetic reasons. Visually, it genuinely feels like Silent Hill. The set design, costuming, and overall atmosphere do a really impressive job of recreating the look and mood of the games, in my opinion, and that alone went a long way in winning me over as a fan. Even when the film made questionable choices, like including Pyramid Head, who fundamentally does not belong in the story of the first game, and other liberties taken such as the inclusion of the sexy nurses instead of the versions that actually appear in Silent Hill 1, I was still willing to give it a pass. It does make little narrative sense, but as the first film adaptation and with no guarantee of a sequel at the time, I initially read these decisions as fan service, visual nods and Easter eggs meant to appeal broadly to longtime fans rather than deliberate betrayals of the source material. I assumed the film was prioritizing recognition and atmosphere over strict fidelity. Although I suspect many fans, including myself, would have preferred a clearer, more faithful adaptation to the first game, I can understand the impulse to include some of the series' more recognizable iconography. Even if I can see the reasons for it, I still kind of ultimately agree that it was the wrong creative decision. Still, I initially approached the film in good faith, attempting to understand and respect the filmmaker's intentions despite its imperfections, and I walked away liking it, especially if you view it as a kind of fan art that appreciates the games instead of being a one-on-one interpretation of it. I was even willing to accept the shift to a female protagonist, despite how far it strayed from the first game, though I couldn't help but miss Harry, who is one of my favorite protagonists in Silent Hill and remains one of the series' most likable characters, rivaled only really by Heather in my mind. Speaking of her, because of this woman's resemblance to Heather, alongside the film's reliance on recognizable symbols from across the franchise, this further led me to assume that the adaptation was intentionally drawing from Silent Hill as a whole, particularly 1 to 3, rather than being a precise retelling of the original. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. You know what they say, ignorance is bliss. That interpretation quickly soured when I found out that the director changed Harry's gender because he thought Harry's behavior was too feminine in the original game. As if freaking out about your missing child in a nightmare town is somehow unmanly. God forbid a man care about anyone other than himself, am I right, fellas? Shoot up some testosterone and go punch a tree or something, I don't know. I want to be fair though, so here's the direct quote so I don't mischaracterize it for you. It quickly became clear, however, Harry never acted like a masculine character. He was constantly dizzy, fainting, talking to himself, screaming, and in fact was very vulnerable. We didn't want to betray the nature of the game by changing the character's feelings and motivations, so we felt it better to change to a female protagonist and retain all of those important qualities. I don't want people to think I have been politically correct, because we changed Harry into Rose. There is no political correctness in Silent Hill. Well, in his attempt to avoid political correctness, he ended up avoiding all correctness in the process. By trying to avoid having correct opinions, the director gutted the characters of everything that made them who they were. The changes aren't subtle, especially in this newest adaptation. They're in fact so extreme that the characters become unrecognizable and the adaptation loses any meaningful connection to the real Silent Hill. After reading that quote, it became difficult to take any subsequent creative decision that seriously. In a genre defined by psychological collapse, demanding emotional restraint to uphold a rigid idea of gender just makes no sense. It's like calling it unmanly to tear up after being hit with pepper spray. A natural physiological response is being misread as a personal or gendered shortcoming. The interview makes it clear that the film's approach was not merely misguided, but actively opposed to the nuance and storytelling that defined the original game. I would disagree that those intentions did not amount to a betrayal of the games then, as he says, or at the very least they reveal a profound misunderstanding of Silent Hill. Changing the protagonist's gender based on a rejection of male vulnerability, alongside including objectifying monster designs without any real reason, both male and female by the way, and discarding the original story's emotional logic all undermine what made Silent Hill, Silent Hill. The film strips the series of its psychological subtlety and replaces it with blunt, and now we know intentionally, offensive symbolism and spectacle, reframing the material in a way that actually does politicize it unnecessarily through its changes, and alienates the substantial female audience that has historically connected so strongly with the series, even if they aren't always the vocal majority. By contrast, the original games managed to appeal to both audiences without alienating either. Those drawn to simple provocative imagery and those seeking psychologically layered storytelling are both satisfied. What was dismissed as politically correct in 2006, as the director says, was often just basic narrative responsibility, giving both male and female characters depth beyond their bodies and situating violence and sexuality within a meaningful context rather than just pure fetishization. Sexualization itself isn't a problem, but it becomes lazy, boring, and offensive when it exists without a purpose. I enjoy sexy characters. I want to see them in my media, along with other diverse and realistic representations of people. I'm not arguing against sexiness itself, but against its thoughtless, sometimes weaponized use. How it's framed and what it contributes to the story should matter. There's plenty of media that exists purely for visual or fetishistic appeal, but film and television should demand more than that. What really matters is what gets lost when characters are reduced to nothing but the sexiness. Strip away nuance and psychological depth, and you strip away the very things that make a story worth watching. There is another film in this entire series that I'll mention briefly called Revelation, and it came out before Return to Silent Hill, and it's so much worse in its interpretations of Heather's story, but getting into it would require an entirely separate essay. Given that it was directed by someone else, it is also just not relevant here, so we're gonna skip over this one for now. A lot of this, especially considering what can be inferred about the director's attitude from previous interviews and the changes made to the narrative from the first movie, made me wary of the remake because it's one of the most deeply meaningful and complex stories in the entire series. It's often heralded as one of the best stories in gaming history, being morally complex, a masterful exploration of liminality, and terrifying not just for its psychological horror, but for the way it seems to torment both the player and James. This game is filled with really beautiful, nuanced, and heartbreaking characters and moments, stories I've learned to hold very close to my heart. A story this good shouldn't need that much rewriting to transfer to film, right? Right? Guys, they're not agreeing with me. Aw, man, even the letter is different. You guys, I'm not exaggerating. I don't think there is a single line from the game in this entire adaptation. All of it has been rewritten. Okay, so I watched it, and maybe you have too. I have to admit, it's actually not as good as I was expecting. It was actually so much worse than my wildest dreams could have hoped for, and I felt often like a pendulum swinging back and forth between laughing hysterically and being genuinely offended by just how rude and tone-deaf this film was. So, let's enter the world of Silent Hill. We come? No, we don't. Speak for yourself. I honestly didn't think it was possible to botch the character portrayals of nearly everyone in this movie, but well, I'll admit when I was wrong. I don't even know where to start, so I guess we'll just start with James since he's the first one we're introduced to. You, like me, were probably expecting a totally normal, boring, dad-coded 30-something, unremarkable by design, our unforgettable, yet forgettable guy, James. Instead, we get a version of James more like this meme. He is smoking a blunt, driving recklessly down a road, probably on his way to Hot Topic. And you might be thinking, well, this is James after he loses Mary, right? He's going mad with grief. No, this is the precursor to meeting her, and he almost hits her with his car. You remember how in the game, James' mental unraveling and the reveal at the end feels almost unbelievable because he's such an average guy. Well, this version of James, it's actually much easier to picture him at strip clubs, especially given the way he treats Mary, even while claiming to love her. He calls her ugly while asking her to move in with him. You know, I don't really want to be in this town, but there's this girl, and she's not much to look at, but there's something about her. Okay, yeah, sure. You might think I'm just being harsh about James's recreational choices or the one joke he makes with Mary, but his behavior goes far beyond that. His tone is genuinely unsettling and predatory at times, and in later scenes he shows clear signs of being controlling and emotionally abusive, even when it's framed as concern for her well-being. He also kisses Maria at one point, even if he pulls away afterwards, essentially briefly cheating despite still looking for Mary. Then he kills Maria through the power of mewing for daring to be interested in him, and somehow manifests Pyramid Head in order to do this. The original James did not act this way. All that is to say is that James is just kind of unlikable in this version, and that completely misses the point of his character in my opinion. In the game he is likable. He's even kind of framed as a good guy, and that contributes to the ending hitting so hard. One of the main things that the original game explores is the idea that just an average guy that you see walking down the street could be capable of doing evil things. This instead is like seeing the dark side of the I love my wife guy, the unholy trinity of kinda evil James, eviler James, and evilest James. He's allowed to be borderline abusive towards her simply because he perceives her as being in danger. That does not read as a man who loves his wife. It's a man who wants to control her and who romanticizes that control in his mind. The underlying impulse, even if she's in danger, is still toxic, and it doesn't just disappear later even when they reach whatever he considers to be a safe place. This is also a smaller, more personal criticism, but I strongly disliked the decision to reframe James as a painter in this version. He's more like a painter anyways, am I right, ladies? Beyond the surface level change though, it pulls the character firmly into the well-worn, tortured artist archetype, the idea that substance abuse and emotional volatility are not only compatible with creativity, but necessary for it. The problem is that the myth gets a relationship between art and suffering backwards. Art almost always exists in spite of emotional turmoil, not because of it. What actually enables creative work is far less romantic. It requires years of technical skill, discipline, sustained focus, networking, and material support. These are the real prerequisites for making art, not addiction or psychological collapse. Worse, the trope functions as a moral shield within the narrative, where James's cruelty towards Maria is softened because it's aestheticized. He may demean her, objectify her, or treat her less as a partner than as a subject, but the beauty of the finished work is implicitly meant to outweigh the cost. Crucially, this myth also collapses under empirical scrutiny. Psychological research consistently shows that while substances like alcohol may briefly lower inhibition, they impair sustained attention, working memory, emotional regulation, and perseverance, all of which serious creative work requires. So the issue is not merely that the trope is romantic, it is also misleading, irresponsible, and badly timed when you zoom out. At a moment when real-life artists are struggling to simply survive, continuing to frame self-destruction as artistic authenticity causes real harm, including within the film industry itself. As creatives, we have a responsibility to consider how these stories shape the next generations, especially if we want meaningful art to continue being made rather than quietly burned out of existence. I saw a review describing this movie as having done nothing new, and many of the comments treated that as a compliment, assuming it meant the film was faithfully adapting Silent Hill. But that isn't what the criticism was getting at. The problem is that it does change quite a bit, but it exchanges the psychologically deep story for stale, simplistic, and overdone, sometimes even harmful storytelling conventions and stereotypes that have been exhausted for years already. Instead of engaging with Silent Hill's complexity, it forces its characters into narrow, prepackaged, and uncharacteristic roles. That's why it does nothing new, not because it's respectful, but because it reduces the story to cliches. The tortured artist trope is a clear example of this, both because it departs from the original games and because it introduces a well-worn, currently harmful storytelling convention. Mary, on the other hand, gets a lot more background in the story compared to the first game. She doesn't haunt the narrative in the same way she does in the games, and I do think this was a mistake, because I love me a good woman that haunts a narrative. Just ask Rebecca. When she does haunt it, it's often reduced to cheap jump scares or a Spider-Woman for some reason. In her story, her illness also is essentially erased, and when it is brought up, if you haven't seen the movie, you'll never believe what I'm going to say next. Its root cause is due to her friendship with lesbians and other minorities. I genuinely could not believe my eyes. The film presents her corruption as the result of influence from a group composed of queer-coded women and a black man, who are explicitly described as microdosing her with a substance that gradually erodes her autonomy and causes lasting harm to her body. This film has made deliberate changes to the original narrative, changes that remove the ambiguity of Mary's illness, and in doing so, erase any nuance and actual, interesting conversation that could be had about it. If you take the original story, even with Mary's illness potentially symbolizing some kind of corruption by the outside world, that story didn't single out any particular group or make such an aggressive moral stance. The core theme wasn't about condemning specific people or even ideologies. But in this version, they make sure to point fingers in a very specific direction, especially through the characters they choose to surround Mary with. This plotline feels unnecessary and adds nothing important to the story. It really only acts to invite conversations around this game to turn more hostile. That's another reason why the movie didn't work for me. The game already offered some compelling, thought-provoking commentary, like the discussion on assisted death for terminally ill patients, particularly in relation to Mary's illness. So why introduce unnecessary commentary through a group that not only was not needed, but actively distracts from the core narrative? In addition to those aspects of Mary's story, I think it's worth mentioning because I could not stop laughing at this part. They decided to give Mary daddy issues because why not? Why not add that in? But she mentions her father died, and James turns his head and sees her father's decapitated head in her closet. His reaction to this is just like, this bitch is weird. And then they move on from this. Never mention it again. Maria as a character was honestly forgettable, aside from that unstyled Temu wig. And in terms of other characters in this story, I don't know if I'm more mad that I'm being forced to defend Eddie in the original games now, or mad at how horrendously Angela's story was portrayed. Actually, I know exactly which one I'm more upset about. Angela is a character that I rarely discuss, but she left a profound impact on me the first time I played Silent Hill. She was heartbreakingly human, embodying a story that is all too familiar to many women and men, yet the narrative treated her with care, thought, and nuance. That makes the betrayal I felt while watching her be reduced, fetishized, and mishandled in this movie all the more painful. Her story in the original game confronts trauma, anger, and abuse, offering a deeply human portrait of suffering and self-destruction. In this adaptation, we meet her in an outfit akin to the pajamas I would wear on the bus to school listening to 21 Pilots in high school. I wasn't even trying to have a good day back then. In other words, she reads as a scary caricature rather than a person. What's really insulting is the way her character and her intentions are framed. At the end of her interaction with James, it seems as if she's almost lightly flirting with him, an inappropriate and tone-deaf choice when you know her background from the original games. "You can always come back and find me," is what she says. What's worse is that she looks vindictive after James rejects her proposition to stay, risking the impression, especially for viewers unfamiliar with the source material, that she is akin to something like a man-hating incel mad that she's been rejected, rather than someone whose lack of trust of men stems from years of betrayal and the trauma from people she should have been able to trust the most. Especially after how she was treated by this game's audience during the release of Bloober's remake not too long ago, this portrayal adds so much insult to injury. There is one scene with her too that is so clearly infantilizing and fetishizing that it left me feeling physically sick. At the same time, the so-called abstract daddy scene is far too literally interpreted in this adaptation, in my opinion. We did not need such a realistic depiction to understand what happened to her. In fact, the original abstract daddy sequence was already borderline too much, and it conveyed her trauma more powerfully precisely because of the abstraction of the character. It was showing a vile act that was hidden away from the world and kept secret by her family. It was also a source of deep shame for Angela, also being buried in herself as a way of coping. But it's thinly veiled. You can see through that veil and understand exactly what was happening to her despite the best efforts to hide it. That is, to me, the entire point of this monster. Even when acts of abuse are hidden, suppressed, or veiled, their impact remains visible and cannot be erased. The abstraction allows the audience to grasp the horror while also emphasizing the heartbreaking reality that hiding trauma does not make it disappear. It also allows for the interpretation that an outsider like James might perceive the thinly veiled signs of Angela's trauma and still choose to do nothing. Giving the monster a literal face, however, erases these readings along with the nuanced symbolic ways it represents the horror that haunts Angela. Eddie, on the other hand, barely appears in the story, and based on his design, especially his clothes and how he kind of resembles James, I feel like this was probably unintentionally, but he kind of comes across more like a visual embodiment of James' internalized fat phobia or something along those lines than a really fully realized character. There's so little to his characterization that analyzing him in any meaningful way almost feels pointless with this one. That said, the moment where he was kicking James was kind of funny. Laura, I also have to mention poor Laura. She is turned into something you'd see in a 2014 ghost caught on camera YouTube video someone did in their basement because they were bored in the 8th grade. They also took away her attitude.
That's a child!
And that's an ugly, pimply bitch!
I feel like most people would agree kids are just mean sometimes, and it can be much scarier to walk past a group of middle schoolers judging you and calling you unk than it is to see a little girl with a teddy bear at the end of a hallway. Her character just feels kind of weird and underdeveloped. Ultimately, I think I would have preferred for them to just omit these supplemental characters altogether, considering the artistic directions they did decide to take with them. But what does all this character stuff really matter anyways? I know the real question on your minds is if there was enough butt shots of the monsters, and I want you not to worry about that. There were plenty. Some of the monsters did get caught up in the Ozempic crisis, though. So many of the monsters in this adaptation don't really make sense. They're scary because the film tells you that they're supposed to be. Take the spider-inspired creature. They just kind of like slapped some sexualized features on it, which made it feel both ridiculous and also offensive. The jiggling butt in this scene was also entirely unnecessary and kind of undermined the tension that existed in the scene. On a more nitpicky personal level, I also really missed the original monster designs, or at least the ones that were interpreted like in the Bloober remake, including the lying figures. Their horror came from their proximity to humanity, not the inhuman qualities. In the adaptation, they look less like people, but in the original design, they closely resembled humans forced into straitjackets that also kind of looked like corsets in the remake. I interpreted them as using their hands to shield the most vulnerable parts of themselves, having their arms in the front and not bound in the back. That subtle detail added a layer of vulnerability and psychological horror that I thought was a brilliant design choice originally. Stylistically overall, not just the monsters, I almost don't need to comment because you can see it for yourself. I didn't like the fact that they went for the ash and smoke angle instead of the fog, but I wrote this off in my mind that it was just showing how many blunts James had to smoke to transport himself into this version of Silent Hill. I will say though that parts of this film made me oddly nostalgic, partially because the wigs and the way certain scenes were shot felt remarkably similar to Twilight. And while I genuinely adore that movie, when your main love interest uncannily reminds the audience of Renesmee, the cursed child of Twilight, purely because of the styling and wigs, because honestly this actress is gorgeous, then something's gone wrong. Despite all of this, they did add in one thing to the story that would genuinely terrify a guy like James: therapy. As for the ending, I don't even really know what to say or how I feel about it completely. A main reason why James is often read as morally ambiguous or even a good person who did a bad thing is because he's generally kind and virtuous in his actions towards others during his time in Silent Hill. This James is largely just a jerk, and his role in Mary's death is almost unrecognizable compared to the original. His motivations and reasonings are so radically different that the two characters are barely comparable. And then, to top it all off, she turns into an octopus and he starts flying through the power of some undefined big dick energy, and not the good kind. He's just a big dick. At least at the end though, we get to see a cameo from, that's right, Travis. It's difficult to even analyze this movie in a more meaningful way because it clearly didn't just miss the mark, but it was aiming for a completely different target than what a lot of people were expecting or hoping for. Its biggest failing, in my view, is its utter lack of respect for the source material. While some creative choices, I admit, may not have been made in bad faith or intended to offend fans, the film strips away the very elements that made Silent Hill resonate. The atmosphere, the characters, the dialogue, and the story itself is vastly different. Fans have grown deeply attached to these elements over the years, and at the very least, the adaptation owed them something meaningful, an acknowledgement of those original strengths rather than a reimagining that abandons nearly everything that made it special in the first place. With a game as popular and well-crafted as Silent Hill, even the Bloober remake was met with heavy skepticism upon release. Its success, however, demonstrates two important points. First, it shows that it is entirely possible to adapt this story to a new medium while staying true to its essence. Second, it highlights just how many crucial mistakes this movie made. The Bloober remake was not a literal one-to-one recreation, but it was evident that the creators were not trying to reinterpret or improve the original story, but rather aimed to respectfully reinvent it for modern audiences and a new medium. It was really clear that they studied the characters, monsters, theories, and the fan community beforehand, seeking as much input as possible. Many argue it's not perfect, but I appreciated it because at the very least, they tried. And it was clear that they understood what made the original resonate, not through something like intuition, but through careful analysis and work in the community that already exists and cares passionately about this game. Did I like things about this film? Yeah! Mostly the elements that actually referenced or overlapped with the source material. I loved the monsters crawling under the car, which was an absolutely terrifying jump scare the first time I played through Silent Hill. I also appreciated the inclusion of the safe squares. I thought that was cleverly reimagined because the red squares were often found in the windows in the background. I thought that was a cool Easter egg to something that wouldn't naturally translate from game to film. I even liked the interpretation of James as an Orpheus-like figure searching for Eurydice in the underworld, as the director described in an interview that I saw, even if I ultimately disagreed with how that concept was executed creatively. I think my biggest complaint is that this movie was carelessly handled. I can't, in all fairness, assume that certain choices, particularly those that villainize marginalized characters, were made with intentional malice. That just wouldn't be fair. But whether deliberate or not, these decisions clearly required more careful consideration and critique during early production to avoid being read as so blatantly offensive. Overall, this project was always going to be difficult to interpret, since so many fans consider the original Silent Hill games virtually perfect and untouchable. Any adaptation would have drawn criticism. I stand by that. That said, I believe it's crucial to engage critically with media, to understand it, but also to highlight where it feels wrong or harmful so future projects can learn from these mistakes. While I did make a few jokes while writing this essay, I do recognize and believe in the importance of allowing creators freedom to explore their own interpretations of stories. The sting with this one comes from knowing how rare it is for a beloved property like this to receive funding and attention, but still feel like a missed opportunity, one that might have been handled better by a team more attuned to the source material. The resources, time, and energy spent here also reduce the likelihood of ever seeing a film that will again get funding and the opportunity to truly capture the tone, feeling, and depth of the original games. That's why it feels disappointing for many longtime fans, even if the movie can be enjoyed as a standalone piece.
At the end of the day, though, it's really not about the plot or the characters or the set design or the wigs. I think we can all agree it's about the Mary, Angela, Laura, Maria, James, Shepard, Hinako, Travis, Harry, Henry, Crane that we became along the way.